Alright, this video is on the Supreme Court case Yick Wo versus Hopkins. I'm recording this for Constitution Day, September 17th, 2025, but I also share this with my students because we're approaching two topics in our American politics course. We're approaching civil liberties and civil rights, and this court case deals with both of them, dealing with due process and equal protection. This concept of due process and equal protection, right? But due process is mentioned only twice in our Constitution, specifically the Bill of Rights in the 5th and 14th Amendment. The 5th Amendment, or at least a part of the 5th Amendment, says no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And in the 14th Amendment, this is also applied to the states, right? Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within his jurisdiction the equal protection, right, the equal application of the laws. Right? Now, let's focus right now on due process. What is due process? It is a constitutional guarantee that the local, state, right, federal government must follow fair procedures and respect an individual's rights before taking away their life, right, death sentence, take away their liberty, incarcerate them, put them in jail, or take away their property, right, like eminent domain. There's two types of due process in sort of the legal concepts. There's procedural, right, how the government acts. Are they providing fair steps, right? Are they providing notification? Are they telling you what crime you've been committed, right, or accused of, right? Are you provided a fair hearing? Are you provided adequate representation? And then there's substantive due process, right, which is a sort of a broader term, in some cases a more vague term, right? What the government does. Some rights are considered so fundamental, right, like the right to privacy, that the government needs a compelling reason to interfere with them, right? That really we believe that there is some protections on our liberties that restrict, right, the government's actions unless there's a compelling reason for them to infringe on those liberties. Now, there's been a number of court rulings dealing about due process and equal protection for non-citizens. I think a hot topic in today's sort of media and legal discussions. We'll be focusing on Yick Wo versus Hopkins, in part that it is one of the most famous and perhaps the most frequently cited case when arguing about due process or equal protection for non-citizens, right? So Yick Wo, we'll talk about some of the background information in a moment. Yick Wo sued the county sheriff, Hopkins, right? Because he was sort of implementing this local ordinance passed by the Board of Supervisors of San Francisco, right? But the county was implementing that law, the county sheriff, right? And so this ordinance regulating laundries housed in wooden buildings, right, which may be justified, right, on face value as fire protection, but it was applied in a discriminatory manner. And who was applying it? It was the county sheriff, right, on behalf of the Board of Supervisors. And so Yick Wo, in prison, right, starts the legal process and sues the county sheriff, and this goes all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. But let's provide some background information about this application of perhaps a constitutional law being applied discriminatorily, in a discriminatory way, right? If we look back in the 19th century and how Chinese Americans were treated, we see that they were met with intense and systematic discrimination, even though they were truly instrumental in the economic development of the American West with the gold rush and transcontinental railroad and just the demand for labor. But even though we recruited, right, immigrants from China to come to meet this demand for labor, and they were doing jobs that many people didn't want to do, very dangerous jobs, dealing with dynamite and working on cliffs to help build the transcontinental railroad, they were met with enormous discrimination, both social, right, economic, political, and legal, Right? For example, the Naturalization Act of 1870 barred Chinese immigrants from ever being able to become citizens. And the Chinese Exclusionary Act was the first U.S. law to prohibit immigration based solely on race. And they were consistently denied civil rights. So in the criminal justice system, right, laws in California and in my home state, Nevada, prohibited Chinese individuals from testifying against white people in court. And that really sort of opened up numerous opportunities for people to cheat or even impose violence upon Chinese immigrants because this testimony would not be allowed in court, right? And there were laws that prevented Asian immigrants from owning land, not just Chinese, but Japanese, right? And so we really see a very ugly side of sort of immigration politics during this time period, right? We saw economic exploitation and segregation. During railroad construction, they did some of the most dangerous jobs. They were paid consistently less than their white counterparts and frequently had to pay for their own food and lodging, whereas other white workers were provided food and lodging. They were barred from very profitable jobs in unions in the Comstock Lode, right, forcing them in really supporting roles. And frequently, once the railroads were built, they were excluded from many other professions by legal mandates that they couldn't hold certain jobs. And Chinese immigrants created their own sort of economic niches, most notably laundries, right? And this was a very common story in San Francisco, where Yick Wo sort of appears, but also in my home state and other states, right? Reno and Tonopah. So the case of Yick Wo versus Hopkins in 1886, right? We have this San Francisco ordinance requiring laundries in wooden buildings to get a permit. The city claimed it was a fire safety measure, and really on the face of it seems extremely reasonable regulation. The problem is in the application of this law. When people applied for the permit, right? Almost really every single Chinese applicant was not allowed to have a permit, right? They were rejected. And depending on the records that you look, all but one of the non-Chinese applicants were granted a permit. Again, this is a long way back. I've seen documents that said all 80 non-Chinese applicants were granted. I've also seen that one wasn't because of other reasons, right? And so Yick Wo, right? He had been operating his laundry safely for 20 years. When he was denied the permit, he continued operating this in violation of the law. And therefore, he was fined and imprisoned, and he sued, right? And he sued, as we mentioned, the county sheriff, right? Still today, San Francisco and the city of San Francisco and the county of San Francisco are a combined government entity, right? It's a city-county government. This ruling is significant in one reason. The court unanimously, right, ruled in favor of Yick Wo, right? And one of the major key findings, right, was that not only are non-citizens allowed to sue and allowed their day in court, allowed due process, but the 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection of the law, equal application of law to all persons, not just citizens, right? And this is widely recognized as the first Supreme Court decision to apply equal protection to non-citizens, right? Here's a landmark quote from this case. Even if a law is fair in its face, if it is applied and administered by public authority with an evil eye and an unequal hand, the denial of equal justice is still within the prohibition of the Constitution. So a constitutional, well-crafted law, right, can still be challenged if it's applied in an unequal way, if it's applied to target a particular group. That is still a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. No matter what great logic is behind the law, if the law is applied by humans in an unjust way, right, you can challenge that court. You can challenge that law in court, right, your due process. And really, I think this matters today, right? It is a foundation of both civil liberties and civil rights for non-citizens. It established that the Constitution protects non-citizens from discriminatory government actions. It upheld the fundamental liberty to pursue, right, life, liberty, and property, right, without being subject to arbitrary or oppressive government action. And that's an important concept behind due process, right? That we have these certain rights, life, liberty, and property, right, that are so fundamental that a government must have a compelling reason, right, to interfere, right? That's the concept of substantive due process, right? It is also an early precursor to the legal concept of desperate impact, a cornerstone of civil rights law, showing that it's not just the text of the law, the words of the law that matter, but the real impact that it has on people, right? And if that is impacting, right, purposefully a target group, right, to discriminate against them, then that law can be challenged, right? A law must be applied equally under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So really, it highlights how important the Bill of Rights is in our lives, in everyone, all persons, right? That the Fifth Amendment, right, that no person, not citizen, right, no person shall be deprived life, liberty, or property without due process of law, right? And the 14th Amendment reiterating that, and that it being applied to the states, not just the federal government, and that every person, right, must be treated equally under the law. This is especially relevant today because you have seen that the Trump administration has argued that non-citizens, or more specifically, illegal or undocumented immigrants, people here illegally, right, do not have the right to due process, right? So Stephen Miller had tweeted that, and in an interview, right, with ABC correspondent Morin, the correspondent said, hey, in our country, even bad guys get due process. But Trump said, right, if people come into our country illegally, that's a different standard. These are illegal. They came in illegally, right? And the Supreme Court has ruled that at the border, right, your right to due process is still exists, but can be limited, right? So if you cross the border illegally and, right, you have the Border Patrol catch you right there, the process of deportation is much swifter in that at the border, your right to due process is limited, but not non-existent, right? But here the administration is literally saying, right, that undocumented immigrants do not have the right to due process, right? Now, they can make that claim, right? They can make that claim, just as Donald Trump, right, has argued that he's going to interpret the 14th Amendment regarding all persons born, right, on U.S. soil not automatically being given birthright citizenship. So he can claim that, but we can legally dispute that because we have separation of powers and checks and balances, and this ends up in the courts, right? And Yick Wo will be, if the courts decide to hear this, will be extremely important, right? Because this question, right, of do undocumented immigrants have a right to due process has not officially been ruled on, right, by the U.S. Supreme Court, but the body of work, including, right, Yick Wo, right, clearly interprets persons as everyone, being applied to citizens, non-citizens, and even undocumented immigrants. And there's a number of cases, right, including Padilla versus ICE, which did not reach the U.S. Supreme Court, but was ruled in a sort of a liberal Ninth Circuit court, right, ruled that the administration's argument that undocumented immigrants are now not allowed due process is incorrect. The Supreme Court did not pick that up, did not reverse it, right? What we see with Yick Wo and just a body of court cases is that these court cases have a core argument that once an individual is within the territory of the United States, they are a person entitled to the fundamental protections of the Constitution, including due process and equal protection, right? So if the Trump administration pushes this further and further and further, if the U.S. Supreme Court is forced to rule on whether undocumented immigrants have the right to due process, the body of legal arguments for well over 150 years, right, supports the concept that the Constitution protects all persons, not just citizens and not just legal immigrants. Hope you found that informative. Until the next Constitution Day.